Today on The State of Us, how the Supreme Court's upcoming decision on abortion will affect America. Welcome to The State of Us. I'm your host, Justin T. Weller, joined, of course, today by Mr. Lance L. Jackson, the senior resident historian here at True Chat, and your friendly redneck liberal. Today, we're taking a look at the leaked first draft from the Supreme Court's initial majority opinion on the possibility of overturning Roe v. Wade and Planned Parenthood v. Casey. That's the 1973 and subsequent 1992 decisions, basically affirming the federal right to abortion. So this is naturally stirring a lot of things up. And there's the more clear, immediate potential social and individual impact, but also the greater political, societal impact that it will have on our country. It speaks to larger themes, not just the immediate issue. So we've got a lot to look at today. But Lance, before we dive in, what is the word of the day?
Well, the word of the day is perfidy. It is a noun. It is 3 syllables, spelled P-E-R-F-I-D-Y, perfidy. It means the deliberate breaking of faith, the betrayal of trust, treachery. And no matter where you fall on this issue, you have either felt perfidy or you are feeling it now, because this is uprooting the social norms that many of us have grown up with. And those of us, very few of us, were alive before this to where this kind of thing would have affected us. So we're showing what the court is and how it works, which most people I don't think understand or bother to learn, because it's like, well, they're there. And yeah, back in history, they did some things. And I think we're living in an historic time when this first draft is doing what it's doing. Now, whether they follow through on it when they vote this fall, we'll see. But it is certainly shaking us to the core as we are still trying to learn to live together in a very difficult time in American history.
One thing that I think is important, because truthfully, I didn't understand a lot of how the Supreme Court really functions. I don't think most Americans do until I was given and have had the opportunity to read. I'm probably about 3/4 of the way through it, a book called The Brethren, which was really the first book of its kind to sort of lift the veil on the inner workings of the Supreme Court. So we're all familiar, with basically when an opinion is issued, right? A majority opinion of the court is issued, that basically that is then the law of the land, so to speak, or the interpretation rather of the law of the land.
Until the Supreme Court changes its mind.
Right.
And that's a very small phrase, but most people don't understand that and didn't catch it if their history or government teacher spoke of it when they were in high school. They were thinking about prom or, their date this weekend or the ball game that they were going to. But that's, people think, well, the Supreme Court said it, that's the law of the land. Well, until you get a new Supreme Court that feels differently, has a different interpretation of the law. And people are like, well, yeah, but when has that ever happened? And you say, well, it's happened here and here and here. And they're like, oh, so not very often. So I put it out of my memory. But it's always there, right? It's always the opportunity for it to take place. And people forget that. They didn't put that in their memory bank because it happens so rarely. And I think we're living in an historic time because we're taking a look at something that has been in place for over 50 years. So most of us who are around don't know of a time when the law was any different.
Right. Can't really remember what it would have been like to live that way. So we're
changing a fundamental belief of the majority of the people. Whether they agreed with it or not, we're looking at possibly changing a fundamental law that the majority of us have grown up with. And that kind of shakes you to your core. And people are like, well, is this possible? I thought the Supreme Court ruled on this. They did, But if the makeup of the Supreme Court changes and those people the majority of those people interpret the Constitution differently, then the law of the land can change. And I think that's a huge thing that people knew in the back of their head, but it's like, yeah, we've really never seen that happen. So it's not really likely. Guess what? We're on the precipice of something like that taking place.
Right. Well, and the other thing to understand is that while the Supreme Court, yes, is established by the Constitution, a lot of their proceedings, a lot of the ways they operate are based on internal rules and traditions. So sometimes they're not even rules. They're just, that's how the court's done it. So that's generally how the court proceeds. One thing that is common is that for the most part, most of the time, and notice there I don't say all the time, the Supreme Court generally respects precedent of the court. So in other words, decisions that have already been made, typically, but not always, obviously this is an example, typically that is then the court's belief that you don't go back and reject or overturn those things unless it's a very serious reason to do so. Some of the most famous cases actually involve, racism, discrimination, slavery, where the Supreme Court actually historically had upheld some of those things as legal, and then subsequently later said, no, these are not. That court was wrong. And part of the reason that was so impactful is because it was unusual for the court to do that. So to take that step spoke loudly of the severity of the issue before them. And I think this is an example, right, where this is one such issue. It is one that people feel very strongly about. Most people feel very strongly about, have a very set opinion on. And so to Lance's point, they can change their mind, right? And when we say there was a different court that decided this. I mean, it's not like these people, had previously said this and now they're changing their minds. It's the Supreme Court when they ruled on this, and now the Supreme Court today is saying we disagree with that. And in fact, what the draft itself says, probably the most succinct piece from it, it was drafted. Well, it's from, I guess we should say, Justice Samuel Alito's office. So there's a decent chance, he may have authored some of it. Probably law clerks were involved. This is another thing that not everybody really knows. But a lot of times, depending on the justice, they don't always even draft their own opinions. So their law clerks do it, and then they review it and change it and take it from there. But what is said in the draft is Roe was egregiously wrong from the start. Its reasoning was exceptionally weak, and the decision has had damaging consequences. And far from bringing about a national settlement of the abortion issue, Roe and Casey have inflamed debate and deepened division. States plainly, we hold that Roe and Casey must be overruled. It is time to heed the Constitution and return the issue of abortion to the people's elected representatives. So the argument goes, just for people that care about, why are they doing this? Why and what the actual opinion says are not necessarily the same thing. But the argument being made, by the opinion, is that essentially the grounds on which the Supreme Court previously held that there is a right to abortion, the argument now contends that's not true. It was an overreach by the court, and that if the people feel this way, then their elected representatives, i.e. the legislative branch, should legislate this.
Well, because that's easier to defend. They're not getting into personality and personal things. They're just saying, this is a poor interpretation of the Constitution, and that if the majority of the people of the United States want to legalize abortion, then it should be a law in and of itself. And I guess that's a good point. The greater point to me, because, obviously we don't know, but this was a big issue in the 2016 election, right? Was we knew that most likely there were going to be a couple of appointments that the next president was going to get to make, and that the Republicans had denied President Obama's trying to fill a position before his term was up, and that the next president could change the majority opinion on the vote on a lot of different issues. And we're now seeing that come to fruition, and the justices are trying to stand on legal ground so that they don't take as many hits on, well, this is what this was all set up to do anyway. But the more important issue to me is, why in the world was this leaked? That's not in any historical study that I've ever done of the court system. Is it leaked? So, I guess I'm a child of Watergate, and leaking something is a huge issue to me when it comes to the government, because it's like, okay, what was the reason behind the leak? Who leaked it? Why did they leak it? And what are they hoping to gain from it? It's interesting. And correct me if I'm wrong, but it's like, this was a back and forth issue with slavery, and we fought the Civil War, and President Lincoln and Congress, the radical Republicans in Congress, that's what they called the Republicans at that time, because most of them lived in the North, and the South was not seated in the Senate because they had broken away and formed their own country. So it was only the Northerners making the rules, passed the 13th Amendment, which to this court's first draft is what they're talking about. They're saying if the country wants this to change, then it needs to be changed by the lawmakers. And so we have an amendment to the Constitution. And so my early interpretation of this is that that's what this court is saying about abortion, that if the country feels that abortion needs to be legal, that the choice of a female to decide what they want to do with their body, then it needs to be a law. It should not have ever been mandated by the court. It should have been done on the legal steps.
Take, for example, the Supreme Court's decision on gay marriage. They can change their mind, right? So the point there is that the only way that you avoid this, okay, the only way that you create a right that is as safe as it gets is to put it in the Constitution of the United States. That's how you make it as safe as possible. But even that's not, even that's not
foolproof.
Foolproof, because we have a society that can change. It is by far and away the safest item, because the difference, right, is that the Supreme Court is looking at the Constitution and is looking at laws that have been passed to determine whether or not something is legal, whether or not you have the right to something. So if you pass a constitutional amendment that says abortion is never legal, or abortion is legal under these circumstances, or just abortion is always legal, right? Whatever it is, well, the Supreme Court's not going to come around then and say, oh, well, we can't do that. What they're going to do instead is they're going to say, well, in the Constitution, it says, so these cases are null because we have the guiding, we have the clear guiding principle. We now have a way to decide that. And it's the same thing with, marriage equality, all that type of stuff, where the Supreme Court has made over the years, right, these landmark decisions, as they often refer to them internally. They're only as safe as the court is at the time. Because the court's job, for people that don't remember, is to try to interpret, right, and decide what existing law says, okay? That's what they're supposed to do. So the way that, arguably, the way that Roe v. Wade was decided was on the basis, essentially, of privacy, right, and the right to... Again, the reason that people say, the right for a woman to control what happens with her body is because that is, in a very simplistic way, what the court basically decided. You have that quote unquote right to privacy that is guaranteed to you in the Constitution. Obviously, there's a lot of people that feel that that's a maybe a bit of a stretch or maybe a bit vague. And that is part of why we are in the situation that we are in now. So we're going to look at some of the other potential effects and talk more about, what exactly could happen. So keep it here on The State of Us, and we'll be right back. We left off at the end of the last segment, Lance. We talked some about, what is the court's job? And also, why is this, an issue again? And I guess the point that I was getting at is basically, I'm not necessarily happy that the Supreme Court, right, is stirring this pot and bringing up this issue, but I do think it illustrates a good point. And the one thing that hopefully a lot of people could agree on that is in this opinion, regardless of how they feel about the rest of the opinion, is that everybody shouldn't be quite so mad at the court. The people you really ought to be angry at are your elected officials. Because the only reason that the court ever had to do something with this in the first place is because your elected representatives failed to legislate this. I mean, that's really the crux of it. We talk about nobody, Lance, or very few people, right, are alive who really remember what it was like before this. But the Supreme Court decided this, but there was nothing that prevented Congress from taking action on it. They just chose not to. They didn't want to hold the vote. They didn't want to make the law. So they abdicated their responsibility, and the Supreme Court was saddled with cases where it felt like we got to try to figure out what the Constitution says about this, and here's what we came up with. And we've talked about that extensively on this show. So yes, we can be angry at them, but I think the other side of that is maybe we should also turn some of that frustration, people on both sides, to our elected officials and say, why haven't you, done anything about this if Americans feel so strongly?
Well, don't you believe that will be one of the outcomes of this if it continues on to fruition, that we will see a big push by those people out there who feel like this is a privacy issue and a woman's rights issue. And okay, if the court's saying we need a law, then by God, you better get a law passed. And I think this is going to wake people up and make that push a very strong one, because you can look at a lot of different opinion polls. And the problem with those polls are, well, not only who did they ask, but how was the question phrased? But you get most of those polls show that most Americans, the majority of Americans, favor some form of a woman's right to choose, whether it's the first trimester or rape or incest. There's some form that the majority of Americans all agree on. So it's like, okay, if the majority feels this way and the majority thinks it's a major issue, then the push is to get the politicians to do something, and you do that by electing people who will do what you want them to do. My concern, I don't care who they get mad at. I mean, get mad at whoever you want, because the people who have been on the other side of this issue for the last 50 years have been upset as well. That's why we use the word perfidy as the word because of the day, because it's a deliberate breaking of faith, betrayal of trust. The people that have been living under this law that don't want it, this interpretation, feel like they've been betrayed. And those people who have grown up with this interpretation of the Constitution and lived under this, now they feel betrayed. So we have an entire nation now of individuals who feel betrayed on this issue. Either they have been or are currently now feeling betrayed. And that doesn't lead to a lot of cohesiveness. That doesn't lead to a lot of positive conversations in the office. And I just, it bothers me because there are also other things that are going on. And this seems to be the societal norm right now, is that we cannot sit down and have a conversation about an issue and come to some conclusion that we can agree upon and move on and do what needs to be done to make this country better and to deal with the problems. We just argue about it. We get in, as you've said many times, in our camps, and then we just lob vindictive comments towards each other.
Well, I think the other thing that we have discussed on the show more than once is part of the problem with this issue in particular is really gauging where Americans are at as a whole, because measuring it, just saying, and you can do this, do you support there being a right to abortion, or do you think that abortion should be illegal? You would find that there are a lot of Americans who would say,
no, but see, but even that phrasing causes some, because I would answer a different way than if you said, does a person have the right to choose what to do with their own body? If you ask that question, I'm going to say, yes, of course they do. I'm personally don't like the idea of abortion, but personally, I'm not going to tell somebody else what to do with their body. I'm not going to tell them they can't put alcohol in their body. They can't put double cheeseburgers in their body. Okay. You can't. And I know, you kind of rolled your eyes at me like that, but I've said it before. Double cheeseburgers are one of the big reasons why health insurance is so expensive, because people don't eat properly. And we're not sitting there and making laws on what people should eat and drink and how much sleep they should get. And we're not controlling people's lives in that area. So why are we drawing the line and saying, well, you can't control, we're going to control people's lives in this area? What makes one any better than the other? And that's where I come from. But personally, I'm not a female. Okay. But personally, I don't like the idea of abortion, but I dislike even more me, a man, telling someone else what they can do with their body. That's where I have the rub. So see, the way you phrase the question would possibly slant my answer.
Well, and that's, I guess, going back to, that's part of the problem, is there's not and as I've shared before, Lance and I sort of jab off the air that, this is my quote unquote favorite topic. And that's meant very sarcastically. It is arguably the topic that I like the least from a discussion standpoint, partly for that very reason, right? Because I don't mean to trigger people by saying certain things or talking about it a certain way. But it's pretty much impossible to talk about it and not royally upset somebody, because people, feel very strongly. So, the way that the polls tend to ask the question is, do you feel that abortion should be legal, or do you feel that abortion should be illegal? And then they go on to, generally speaking, provide additional options of, or do you feel that abortion should be legal in certain circumstances, or that it should be illegal in certain circumstances? And again, this goes back to what we've talked about before. Part of the reason this is a complicated issue is you'll find that a majority of Americans, and you can find poll after poll that supports this. One of the more reputable ones that was done recently, the Pew Research Center finds that 59% of adults in 2021 believe that abortion should be legal. Now, if you break that down, you can get a higher number if you say only legal in the most extreme cases, and you can get a low number if it's just should always be legal no matter what, right? Which would, by the way, include, like you can abort up until the day before you give birth, right? So the point there is that there's a wide range of feelings depending on where you fall, even in the spectrum of abortion ought to be at least in some cases legal. Then there's this whole big division inside of that of under what circumstances. And there's the division inside the camp, right, of the people who feel that maybe similarly to how Lance does, that personally, that would probably not be something they would ever do, but they're not comfortable making that decision for other people. So again, one of the reasons why the legislature hasn't done anything, which isn't, I'm not excusing it because I think it's a sore excuse. It's literally their job. So, just because it's hard doesn't mean that they shouldn't take a stab at it. I don't purport to support that at all. I think their job is to take on the hard stuff. But one of the reasons they haven't is for that reason, because getting to a consensus of what, most people can agree to is tricky. And as I've always contended, there are larger fundamental issues that nobody wants to talk about when you talk about abortion, because they're a pain to try to answer. They're even harder than I think answering, the questions about, well, when should abortion be legal or when should it not be? Unless you're just a blanket, it should be legal no matter what, under all circumstances, absolutely. Or it should never be legal under no circumstances, no matter what, And generally speaking, I don't think actually that most Americans are in either of those camps.
Well, just typically an extreme idea doesn't have a lot of support.
Yeah.
On either end.
Because keep in mind, if you're sitting there thinking, well, I think I might be one of those people. Okay, but are you really, right? Because take the example that I illustrated before. Are you really okay with a baby being born that actually could live on its own, but, without artificial support of any kind, being aborted? I mean, maybe you are, but really think about that. It comes out, it's breathing.
But then you have somebody like me. I'm saying, wait, you're arguing up the wrong tree here. All your examples I don't care about. We're talking about a live human being getting to choose what they want to do. And see that, and you're not even, and you're not, but the people who believe the way you're talking will say, oh, you're going to do this and this and this. That's not the issue. The fundamental issue is you don't want people to tell you how you should live. What gives you the right to tell other people how they should live?
Which goes back to what I've contended before, which is the larger issue that's not addressed is it's a sticky situation because the way the Supreme Court has decided it at the moment, right, until it's overturned, is they used a determining factor that basically gives states some leeway in determining at what point a fetus becomes a viable human. Because whenever we decide that happens, now you have, here's where it comes down to it, right? Up until we decide that fetus is in fact a person, then there's only one set of rights to consider in my mind, right? And that is the rights of the human, which in this case is the woman with the child. The problem and the issue that comes into play from a legal standpoint is the minute that we decide that fetus is also a person, is also a human, now you have two sets of rights. And unfortunately, then you get into, well, not everybody's rights can win out. Somebody's rights are going to be stepped on. And the problem is we've never really agreed as a society when that takes place, right? Technically, right now, legally, you don't really become a human with, most of your rights until you are actually born, right? Until you are actually born, you're not bestowed those rights. So what we've created is a pseudo set of, very strange, very varying across states when technically you sort of become human, but aren't really yet. And you get some rights, but you don't really get all of them. And I guess what I'm getting at here is not that I think that there's a great marker. What I'm saying is that's part of why we're in this situation, is because people don't agree and lawmakers haven't taken it on as a, let's try to come to some kind of frickin' decision here across the board about what this is going to be. And I don't know, maybe we can't. And that's what we're going to talk about coming up next. Keep it here on The State of Us. We'll be right back. Maybe, Lance, maybe the issue is unsolvable in that we are not going to get a good majority of 320 million Americans to come to a comfortable decision on all of those many questions that you and I threw out, right? Maybe we're not going to get that to happen. And that's a tough thing for people to face. Maybe that's where we're at.
I was alive and I talked to healthcare workers who worked before the Roe v. Wade decision. All right. So if the Supreme Court takes this to what people think the conclusion will be, you didn't stop abortions. Abortions happened long before, hundreds of years of abortion happened before Roe v. Wade made it legal. So if you think you're stopping abortions, you're not. You just made it illegal. Now you've made women choosing, and sometimes we get into the whole social issues, which we don't have time to do today. Maybe that's a different show. The rape, the incest, all those kinds of things, all those issues that we don't have time to talk about today. But women will still seek that out because according to the older healthcare workers that I talked to when I was growing up, they said, we saw it all the time. Not that they saw the abortions and did them, but we saw the ramifications of that. We saw the women who had chosen to what they called in the day the backroom abortions, or had tried to do it themselves, and the healthcare situations that occurred because of that. So just because there's a law there that says you can't do it doesn't mean you're going to stop it. It's still going to happen because history shows us that it does. My second one is, and this is more of a legality and a question to you. If the Supreme Court chooses to do this, what stops a state from saying, well, in our state, we can do it? Because the understanding of the way you explained the Supreme Court's early decision, this first draft, is that the lawmakers need to pass a law, right? So if you live in a state where the majority of the lawmakers want it to happen, then can't those states, under this ruling, wouldn't those states then be allowed to pass a law that says that state will allow doctors to do that? Because one thing that people are forgetting is that just because your state says it can happen, go find a doctor who will do it. Because that was something that the people who were against it put a lot of pressure. I mean, I don't know if you guys remember, but as an older person, I remember when they were bombing clinics, when they were harassing doctors who did abortions, the people who were against this. So we've seen violence on the other side. So now we see violence on this side.
Here's the breakdown of, just briefly, what happens the minute that this occurs. What takes place across the United States of America? Well, as it may be no surprise, it depends greatly on where you live. There are 17 states, Lance, that right now today have on the books laws that affirm the right to abortions in some degree. Okay. And
this Supreme Court decision would not take those away.
It would not. So the minute that this decision takes effect, for example, if you live in Nevada, you will still have the right to an abortion, because then you also have 10 states, Lance, where they don't have laws either way. So it is unclear, because if you're in that state right now, okay, and for example, you're an office that provides abortion, is it legal or no? Well, the Supreme Court hasn't told you that it's illegal. They also haven't told you that it's legal. So now in these states, you're just kind of, what do we do? And then the rest of the states, the remaining states, have one of three possible situations. They may have bans that predate Roe versus Wade that are currently unenforced. So the thinking legally would be that those laws are still on the books. So if Roe v. Wade is overturned, they go back into effect. And then you've got states with so-called trigger laws, okay? These are laws that ban all or nearly all abortions that have been passed since Roe that would automatically go into effect if Roe is overturned. And then you have this last kind of strange set of states, states with post-Roe restrictions that are currently deemed unconstitutional. You might say, well, how's that different than the other stuff? Well, these are some of these states, and I'll call out our state, Ohio, have not outright banned it, right? So there's not a law on the books that says abortions are never legal. What they do have is they have laws that are deemed unconstitutional currently that narrow the limits on abortions. So basically what you have, right, the day this is overturned, what you end up with is this huge hodgepodge all over the country. And then you've got the rest of the states that are a mess, right? So there you have it, Lance.
Okay.
Maybe what we've highlighted is that it's a mess, right? Which is part of why we're talking about this, because people feel strongly.
And the Supreme Court is basically looks like they want to open up the Pandora's box and make us deal with the mess.
Yes. Which.
And I know that's too simple, but that,
no,
it's.
I know, because there's so many people, right? And I am sympathetic to that, who feel highly threatened by this. And to that, I am very sympathetic. At the same time, I have been saying for years, I think, that we have not solved this problem. We have merely come to a standstill, which is where we have been for 60 years. And we are now, again, faced with, are we going to make a decision, or are we again going to operate under some kind of stalemate position? And I don't know. I really don't know what's going to happen, because it is quite the patchwork. So on that note, Lance, why we have this conversation today?
Well, because at True Chat, we have a mission, and our mission is to educate people by providing honest, open, and respectful conversations. And we've had that today about a very tricky issue, and I'm sure we will have it again throughout the summer and into the fall as we find out more and more about what's going on. And there are many other issues that we could have addressed today and just don't have the time. But if you like these kind of honest things and you hear people who are willing to sit down and talk about them, then we're the place that you want to listen. And if you're having these kind of conversations or can't have these conversations in your home or office, and you say, well, there's this place where they just kind of lay it out and let you kind of think about it and come up to your own decisions and your own choices, then tell them about us and tell them as a podcast. They can find us on Spotify, Overcast, Stitcher, Apple Podcast, and everywhere podcasts are found.
The articles that I mentioned, the original Politico piece and the Wall Street Journal piece, are both linked at thestateofus.org. That's our website. There's a lot of great resources there. You can always see what we're referencing on the show. That's a big part of what we do, try to make sure you have access to the same info that Lance and I use to stay informed. So please do take a look at that. We're available Tuesdays and Thursdays, first thing in the mornings, as a podcast, and then heard on the weekends on AM and FM radio stations across the country. I think Lance pitched the shutout today on the word of the day, so congratulations to him on a victory well fought and well won. For the State of Us, I'm Justin T. Well.
I'm Lance Jackson.
Special thanks to producer Bradley Butch, and thank you all, our audience, for tuning in. We'll see you next time. Be the change. Be sure to check out our website, thestateofus.org, for books, articles, and all the ways to tune in. thestateofus.org.